This afternoon we have the pleasure of having a conversation with Charlie Chittenden from Buck Consulting. Welcome, Charlie.
Thank you. I'm Charlie Chittenden. I'm a pension actuary at Buck Consultants. I've been there for about 11 years. I've been doing pension consulting for 33 years. And I'm a fellow of the Society of Actuaries, an enrolled actuary, and a member of the American Academy of Actuaries.
Charlie, just to get us started on analyzing the magnitude of what a pension costs. If you were to go out on the market today and buy a pension for someone who's going to retire July 1 that will pay them $100,000 for the rest of their life starting at age 60, what would be the approximate cost of that pension?
Well, depending on
present value.
Yeah, depending on the age and sex of the individual, and if I'm valuing the pension based on pension assumptions that are commonly used, it would be a factor of about 9.8 or so times the annual benefit. So it might be $980,000 for this one individual. That's for a 65-year-old. It would be more if they were younger.
And if you got it down to age 50 and $100,000,
it might be
per year.
It might be $1.2 million, $1.3 million.
And so that's the cash value to buy it at present value today.
Yes.
So that's a substantial amount of money that we're dealing with just each individual.
It is. The pensions are worth a lot of money. They are quite valuable.
Well, let's suppose today, to help us understand how pensions work, especially some of the actuarial concepts, that we were going to establish a new pension fund. We had 100 new employees, and we're just going to pay or give them credit for service from this day forward. How does an actuary go about calculating how much money we need to be able to guarantee that pension is funded properly on an actuarial basis?
Well, the first step would be to figure out, as we did just a moment ago, what the pensions would be worth when the people reach retirement age. And having figured that out for all the employees that you're hiring, we would then try to figure out how much we have to put in as a level dollar amount or a level percentage of pay so that it would accumulate to the right amount by the time the person's ready to retire.
So all of this is a pre-funding concept?
Yes, it's all pre-funding. Pensions are pre-funded. Pay-as-you-go is not permitted by accounting standards, and the problem with pay-as-you-go is that it starts with very low or no contributions if everybody's active, but then the contributions escalate when people start to retire and they become unmanageable. So for that reason, pensions are pre-funded, both in the private sector and the public sector.
Now, we have the term future service liability. How does that fit in here?
The actuarial cost method that the actuary uses to determine the contribution divides the liability into two parts, one part relating to past service and one part relating to future service.
And in our new pension, we're only going to have future service, right?
At the beginning, we'll only have future service. So what happens there is the actuary figures out, according to the actuarial cost method, how much liability is added by 1 year of service going forward. That's the normal cost, and that would be the contribution in the first year.
And to reach all of these calculations, you have actuarial assumptions. Could you give us some examples of actuarial assumptions that would come into play?
Sure. You have really two kinds of actuarial assumptions. You have economic assumptions and demographic assumptions. The economic assumptions are typically the investment return assumption, salary scale, and sometimes inflation if you have a cost of living provision. And then the demographic assumptions relate to active employees changing status through termination, disability, retirement, or death. So you study the rates at which people change from active to another status. Those are the demographic assumptions. And you relate those to present values using the economic assumptions about how much money they're going to make in the future, where they're going to wind up in their final average salary, and how to discount that present value back to the present time with interest.
Okay, so we're setting up this pension. We're only going to cover future years of service. And we've applied all of our actuarial assumptions. Now there's this thing called normal cost. How does that play into this establishing this new system?
Well, the actuarial methodology would call for you to pay a normal cost every year on behalf of each employee, each active employee. And the normal cost is the value that the actuarial cost method assigns to the valuation year, which is, you can think of it as the value that the employee receives for working 1 year, value in terms of a pension.
And the assumption is if you pay the proper normal cost each year for each employee, by the time that employee retires, you'll have enough money to pay for the benefits, assuming all of the assumptions are correct.
Yes, that assumes that you don't change the pension, that the assumptions are correct in terms of you actually get the 8% return that the actuary assumes, and that people retire when they're supposed to and don't live any longer than they're supposed to. If all that happened, then all you would have to pay would be normal costs.
Charlie, in California, we have the ARC divided into an employee and employer contribution. And the employee contribution in most all circumstances is fixed as a percentage of payroll, whereas the employer contribution is stated, but there's also they have to pay whatever is required to make the pension whole. Is that normal in most pensions, or well, what is the norm from your experience?
For public pensions, it is the norm to have the employee contribution fixed, and sometimes it's zero, so that it's all on the employer. When it is fixed, and say 5% of pay, which is common, it creates a leverage situation for the employer. In other words, if the total contribution goes up by 20%, the employer's contribution might go up by 33% because the employee contribution is carved out of there. So it puts the employer portion in a leveraged situation.
And by a leveraged situation, meaning the employer has to pay more.
Yes, the employer's increase in contribution rates is likely going to be greater than the increase in the total contribution rate because the employee portion is fixed.
And if we have an unfunded liability that you're trying to amortize and you add that to your ARC, that's the employer's responsibility?
Oftentimes that's the way it's done. The employee's contribution, which is a fixed rate, is carved out of the normal cost, and the employer pays the balance of the normal cost plus all of the amortization for the unfunded actuarial accrued liability.
Charlie, if you have reviewed our City of Historic Realignment scenario, the issue of pension liability has become surrounded by the word unsustainable and unsustainability. And it's a major political issue. As an actuary, do you have a tool to measure the relative health of a pension fund?
Yeah, the pension fund health, the fundamental measure is the funded status, which is the ratio of the assets to the actuarial accrued liability. And usually it's done based on the actuarial assets, which are subject to smoothing, and the actuarial accrued liability, which is the liability for past service under the method.
In today's economy, is a market analysis of assets something that is viable?
Yes, and often the ratio is expressed both ways. The official measure is usually the actuarial value of assets divided by the liability, but you can also show the market value of assets divided by the liability as well as the market value of funded status.
So in short, funded status is just adding up all your assets and giving them a value, whether market value or actuarial value, and dividing that by all of your pension liabilities that you've calculated in that you're going to have to pay in the future. Is that correct?
That's right. It's a point-in-time measurement of the assets to the ratio of the assets to the liabilities.
The city of HR also had a recent actuarial evaluation where the actuary smoothed the assets over a 10-year period. And this is because they had a huge market loss of 25%. What is asset smoothing, and when, in your opinion, is it actuarially reasonable?
Smoothing is a technique that actuaries have developed to prevent the contribution rates from jumping when the market values of assets move sharply. So you can have large investment gains and losses in a year that would otherwise cause the contribution rate to rise suddenly, and that is a problem for governments that have to budget for their costs in advance. So actuaries have for a long time been using smoothing, and they used it both in the public and the private sectors. The question of how much smoothing to do and whether it's appropriate relates to the objectives of the fund. One objective is to maintain stable contribution rates. Another objective is always to be 100% funded. Those two objectives are in opposition. And you have to decide which one you want to do more. If you want to maintain stable contribution rates, you will want to smooth. But by doing that, you will from time to time be a ways away from 100% funded. And if you want to make sure that you're always at 100% funding, because, for example, you may go out of business, or you may have employers withdraw and you want them to leave only if we're 100% funded, then you would want not to smooth. But you have to decide, each system has to decide which objective is more important for it. In the example that you give, the system has decided that it needs stable contribution rates, and so it's using significant smoothing, a 10-year period, to dampen out the effects of investment gains and losses. It's only the investment gains and losses that are smooth. You have gains and losses from liability sources, but those are generally small and don't affect the contribution rate as much, so they're not subject to smoothing.